Institute for Education Research. Welcoming you here to the grounds of UNSW, I would like to acknowledge the Bedical people that are the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here today. We apologise for our late commencement for this lecture. Just some technology issues, but some things just don't change, do they? But we're very, very happy to welcome everyone here in the lecture theatre at UNSW and also online. Going to ask for one of our wonderful committee members, Professor Andrew Martin, to make the introduction to our guest speaker.
Thank you very much, Nolene, and apologies also for the technology hitch, but we've got a workaround and here we are. I'd like to acknowledge country as well, the Bedical people. I'm Andrew Martin. I'm Professor of Ed Psych in the School of Education here. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the Sir Harold Wyndham Memorial Lecture. It's a highlight on the New South Wales Institute of Educational Research's calendar. And so Sir Harold Wyndham was in fact Director General of Education in New South Wales from 1952 to 1961. He had a wide range of research interests, including individual differences, and one of the first to emphasise research-based insight into the practice of education. He represented Australia on many international education committees and forums, and all his contributions led to his appointment as patron of the New South Wales Institute of Educational Research from 1973 to 1988. The Sir Harold Wyndham Memorial Lecture was inaugurated by this institute in 1989. And so tonight it's our great pleasure to have Professor John Sweller. John was a psychology undergrad at the University of Adelaide in 1969, PhD in psychology in 1972, and a distinguished program of work in cognitive psychology, and importantly located in a school of education, not in a school of psychology. And that has made a huge difference to reach and impact. Through thick and thin, John's program of research has prevailed, and now federal and state departments of education lean on this research program to shape initial teacher education as well as what is now expected in schools. Now practice has caught up with research, and research is aligned with practice as we now cognitive load theory is something of a household name. John is a very humble and generous giant. And he mixes that with a sense of humour. I think half the time he's not meaning it to be a sense of humour, but it is riotous. There's a 2016 interview that is just this is the third time I've actually read it. On the previous two, I just wanted to dip into it. Some of the things John was saying. It's an interview with John, so he reflected on his days as a school student. He said, "At school, I began as a mediocre student who slowly deteriorated to the status of a very poor student." But he made his way to university and commenced dentistry. Would you believe? But dentistry wasn't quite his thing, and quote unquote, given the physical proximity of the teeth to the brain, I decided next to try my luck at psychology. And it was a good choice because my grades immediately shot up, and John's here immediately shot up from appalling back to mediocre. He said, "While I was no better at sitting for exams or obtaining good grades on normal assignments than I had ever been, on some occasions we were given research assignments requiring us to devise psychological experiments. I seemed to have some skill understatement of 2024, of 2016, I seem to have some skill at theorising about psychological variables and devising experiments. Some skill indeed, John. And so if we fast track to the end of this interview, lessons learned, this speaks not just to the experimentalist, but to the person, who John is. Lessons learned, one of them is, if you are confident of your ideas, persist. Another lesson learned, do not hesitate to advance ideas conflicting with the current zeitgeist. They may be ignored for a while, but if they do have merit, they are very likely to be ultimately recognised. Another lesson learned, follow up your ideas systematically and build a program of research. The merit of one's work may not become clear for decades, but such a program of research has a better chance of obtaining eventual recognition than an identical number of unrelated studies. And then finally, how did I change people's views? I do not think I did. Rather, people retired, back to the humour, people retired or died to be replaced by younger people who did not have to carry, and this is poignant, who did not have to carry the burden of their own long history. Societal renewal and change over the generations is as much a part of the human condition as individual resistance to change. Well, society has shifted. Policy and practice have shifted and are listening to what has emerged from John and the many colleagues he has mentored over the years. And here we are tonight to do so as well. And so I welcome Professor John Sweller. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Andrew. I can't wait to hear myself speak. I'm going to be talking about, let me first thank everyone for the invitation. It is, of course, a pleasure and a privilege to be here. I'm going to be talking about cognitive load theory. The theory is an instructional theory based on our knowledge of human cognitive architecture. Architecture, which consists of the way in which we learn, how we solve problems, how we think. That architecture is used to produce hypotheses, to generate hypotheses. Those hypotheses are then tested using randomized controlled trials. If the test works out, we may have a new cognitive load effect. And we've generated about 1.5 dozen instructional effects by that process. So in this talk, I'm going to spend much of my time talking about that cognitive architecture. And then I'll follow that with some of the more prominent and more interesting effects. So let's go into human cognitive architecture. I'm going to proceed by talking about several points or considerations when we think about human cognitive architecture. Each one is extremely well established. They're not new, and I didn't invent them. I've put them together in a particular way, and they all relate to each other. But the points themselves, in other words, the entities that constitute human cognitive architecture, they're not novel. They tend to be ignored, and they shouldn't be. So, first point, categories of information. You can categorise information in a huge variety of ways, possibly an infinite number of ways. But most of those categories tend not to have instructional implications. One category, devised or discovered by David Geary at the University of Missouri, distinguishes between biologically primary and biologically secondary knowledge, biologically primary and biologically secondary information. What's the difference between the two? Primary information, biologically primary information, is information we have evolved to acquire over countless generations. Some of it is immensely complex, but we don't find it complex. We've evolved to acquire that information. Biologically secondary information is information that we may need for cultural, societal reasons, and which we can acquire, but we haven't specifically evolved to acquire that information. We developed, invented perhaps, schools in order to provide that information to the general population. That secondary information, not the primary information. Let me give you one or two examples. Probably the most complex activity that humans engage in is learning to listen and speak. It's an immensely complicated activity. And it's something that we don't teach. To give you an example, if most of us, if we're not speech pathologists, if we were required to teach children how to organise their mouth, their lips, their tongue, their voice, their breath, in order to speak their native language, we couldn't do it. And we don't do it. Kids learn that, and it's, from an information processing perspective, immensely complex just by functioning in a normal society. Similarly, listening. I'm talking to you now, but all that's coming across from a physical perspective is a whole lot of modulated sounds. It's not what you're hearing. I mean, you are hearing those modulated sounds, but you're really hearing is somebody speaking. Nobody taught you how to do that. It's biologically primary. And that lack of a distinction between biologically primary and biologically secondary information has in some ways been unfortunate, possibly even catastrophic for education. Because we've tended to assume that the way we acquire biologically primary information, this was before we made the distinction between those two categories of information, we tended to assume that the way we acquire biologically primary information is the same as we acquire biologically secondary. And it isn't. You can see that from the recent and hopefully rapidly disappearing reading wars. The assumption was made about 1 or 2 generations ago. Well, the argument went as follows. Look at the ease with which kids learn to listen and speak. We ought to get them to learn to read and write in exactly the same way. It's obviously highly effective. But reading and writing is not biologically primary. Now, there's no shortage of randomised control trials indicating that you have to explicitly teach kids how to read and write using a phonics approach. But in a way, you just have to look at a fairly vague history of humanity to realise the difference. Humans learn to listen and speak when humans first evolved, as far as we know, certainly prehistory. Humans figured out how to read and write about 5,000 years ago. For the vast bulk of that time, almost all of it, the percentage of people who could read and write was tiny, absolutely tiny. A small proportion of any population that you chose to look at could read and write. Reading and writing only became common literally about 150 years ago, when mass education came along. Before then, illiteracy was the normal state of affairs. People didn't pick up reading and writing in the same way as they picked up listening and speaking. Everybody could listen and speak. Almost nobody could read and write. So there's a difference between biologically primary, the example is listening and speaking, and biologically secondary information. I might add that the biologically primary information is vastly more complex than secondary. But we pick it up as a first language easily, simply, without tuition. Consider other issues such as learning general problem-solving strategies. Now, most of us, if we're asked to specify the problem strategies that we use, the general strategies, couldn't do it. Doesn't mean they don't exist, they do exist. They can't be taught because all of us, most of us, acquire those strategies easily, automatically, and without tuition. Specific problem-solving strategies for particular areas. If I give you a mathematics problem like A plus B all over C equals D, solve for A, you have to learn how to solve that. But you won't learn how to solve it unless you go to school. On the other hand, if you want to go from point A to point B, this is before GPS or even before maps, You knew how to do that. But that's complicated as well. The procedure you use is called, or the strategy you use is called means-ends analysis, and that simply means you look at where you have to go, extract the differences between the two, find a problem-solving operation that will reduce those differences, put that operation in place, then repeat the whole process. Now, for all of us, that's ridiculously simple. It's not actually simple. The work on means-ends analysis was largely carried out by people at the University of Pittsburgh, and the book that resulted, called Human Problem Solving, authored by Newell and Simon, it's almost 1,000 pages long. It's one of the early artificial intelligence programs. There's an enormous amount of information involved in using that particular strategy. We don't find it difficult. And why don't we find it difficult? Because it's biologically primary. It's a waste of time attempting to teach that in schools. I've just described the means-end strategy to you, and I'm sure you all agree, well, I'm not going to go into a classroom and teach people how to do that. They know how to do it. And they know how to do it because it's biologically primary. They may not know how to solve a particular mathematics problem. They may not know how to go about writing an essay on the causes of World War I. To be taught that, but they don't need to be taught a general problem-solving strategy. So, cognitive architecture that we're concerned with is biologically secondary. There's a whole lot of different cognitive architectures for biologically primary skills, but in education, we really don't need to be concerned about them. We do need to be concerned about the cognitive architecture associated with biologically secondary information, and that distinction between primary and secondary information is the first point that I really want to make. Second point, how do we acquire biologically secondary information? Well, there are two ways. One way is to engage in problem solving. Okay, I've got to work something out. I've got to find out something. How do I work it out? How do I find out? I tend to use means-ends analysis for that process. And it works. It can be extremely slow. Anyone who's conducted research knows how incredibly slow it can be. And it's not easy. But we may have no choice but to use problem solving to acquire novel information. And can I emphasise, one, we're talking about biologically secondary information, but that problem-solving process is biologically primary. Don't have to teach people how to acquire the information. Don't have to teach general problem-solving strategies. They're biologically primary. We use that biologically primary skill to acquire biologically secondary information. So that's one way of acquiring it. long and slow and difficult. But there's another biologically primary skill that humans have for acquiring information. And we're using that right here and now. Humans can acquire information, enormous amounts of complex information from each other. It's possibly the reason that humans have become the dominant mammalian species on Earth. We're extremely good at doing that. And we're the only species that's able to do it to any great extent. We engage in that second way, communication. We engage in that in order to obtain information constantly. We're constantly involved in that process. We're involved in it right now, but we're involved in it everywhere. There's a possibility, some people have suggested, that may or may not be correct, that reasons the Neanderthals disappeared was not because they had smaller brains than us. They appear to have had bigger brains, and they may well have been even better at solving problems than us. They weren't as good at, they possibly weren't as good at communicating huge amounts of information to each other. It's really, really important. And the reason I'm emphasising it is because there's been a movement in the last, again, 1 or 2 generations to suggest that in education, we should be getting kids to work things out for themselves, be directly communicating information to them. For reasons that are not terribly clear, the only category of humans that we feel should not get information directly from other humans, directly, explicitly from other humans, are school kids. That's been catastrophic. Again, it's changing, thank goodness. So, 2 ways of obtaining novel information. Now, irrespective of how you obtain it, whether you obtain it from other people or whether you work it out yourself using problem solving, you've got to process it. And the structure we use to process novel information is called working memory. It used to be called short-term memory, and a lot of people still call it short-term memory. They're the same. There's no distinction between working memory and short-term memory. And when dealing with novel information, working memory has 2 unusual and in some ways surprising characteristics. First characteristic, extremely limited. It's extremely limited in capacity. We can hold approximately 7 elements or units of information in working memory at a time. we can process, and by process I mean organise, deal with, handle in some way, 2, maybe 3 units of information, elements of information. Very limited capacity. And all novel information, all novel biologically secondary information, keep in mind I'm only talking about biologically secondary information, I'm not talking about biologically primary information. All biologically secondary information has to be processed by that limited capacity structure. It gets worse. It's not only limited in capacity, it's limited in duration. If you don't rehearse the information that you've just considered, it'll disappear after about 18 seconds. Let's call it 20 to round it up. 20 seconds, it's all gone, or almost all of it's gone. So, working memory is extremely limited in capacity and duration when dealing with novel information. How in the world do we function cognitively? Because working memory, that's all we've got when we're processing novel information. There's another structure, long-term memory. Term memory may have limits in duration and capacity, but if it does, we don't know where they are. Effectively, we can consider it to be unlimited. We have an enormous long-term memory, absolutely enormous. People, if you ask them, what sort of, how's your memory? What sort of memory have you got? Oh, I've got a terrible memory. We all feel we have a terrible memory. We don't. We've got a spectacularly large, immeasurably large long-term memory. The reason we feel we've got a very limited long-term memory, not much there at all, is because first, we tend not to be aware of what's in long-term memory, and awareness or consciousness is what's in working memory, not what's in long-term memory. If you think of what's in your long-term memory like right now, the only thing you think of is what you're thinking of right now. The rest, you're not conscious of it. And a lot of our use of long-term memory isn't immediately obvious to us. If I give you a sentence like, I went into a restaurant, the waiter spilt soup on my lap, the waiter didn't get a tip. But he here listens to that, so what in the world is he talking about? You all understand perfectly well what I'm talking about instantly. How come? Look at what you have to have in long-term memory in order to understand that extremely simple set of sentences or scenario. You've got to know what a restaurant is. It's a place that sells food, and it sells food in a particular way. It's a supermarket sells food as well, but they're different. You've got to know that that food is normally something fairly solid, but sometimes it can be semi-liquid. And when it's semi-liquid, it's frequently, not always, called soup. It's all got to be held in long-term memory. You have to know one of the properties of liquids is they can be poured, they can be spilt. You have to know that waiters serve food, and you have to understand what's meant by serve food in a restaurant. Again, all from long-term memory. You have to know that we humans don't like food spilt on us. And we certainly don't like it spilt on our lap. You have to know that a lap is a really peculiar anatomical and linguistic structure. You all have laps. I don't. Your lap disappears as soon as you stand up. All of that has to be held in long-term memory for you to have understood that statement. And it goes way beyond that. You know, what's a tip? Why is the waiter getting a tip? Why didn't the waiter get a tip in this particular case? How's our monetary system work? How's our, in a sense, our culture work? You need to know all of that. All in long-term memory. Now, there are things you learn in school that you end up learning equally as well as the things you needed to learn to understand the waiter spilling soup example. What I'm saying is that understanding comes from what's in long-term memory. But he gave any of us a strategy for understanding the sort of 2 or 3 sentences I gave you before. You just do it. That part of it is biologically primary. And that really leads me to the last aspect of human cognitive architecture that I want to talk about. I don't need to tell this audience that education is transformative. We're involved in education because it's transformative. We become different people once we're educated. Here's the reason why it's transformative. And it goes all the way back to working memory. I talked about the limitations of working memory a few minutes ago. Working memory is transformed, derives information from long-term memory as opposed from the external environment. In other words, when I talked about long-term, about working memory being limited in capacity and duration, those limitations no longer exist when long-term memory deals with information that's been stored in long-term memory. Working memory deals with information that's been stored in long-term memory. There are that we know of. We are transformed, and the reason for talking about these things is because it tells us why education is transformative, why we become different people. We can do things, we can think about things in a way that is completely impossible when we're dealing with novel information. What's in long-term memory transforms us. The peculiarities of the education business is that we're allowed to talk about learning. That's good. We're not allowed to talk about memorising. That's a bad thing to do. They're exactly the same. In both cases, if you learn something, something has gone into long-term memory. If nothing has changed in long-term memory, you haven't learned anything. Long-term memory has to change when you learn. As I said earlier on, we have enormous long-term memories. Right, so that's the general architecture of human cognition. And as I said right at the beginning, cognitive load theory uses that architecture to generate hypotheses, and they're tested. And if the tests work out, and that means we get a positive result on a randomized controlled trial, and we replicate that result on 2, 3 or more occasions, we get a new cognitive load effect. I won't be talking about all the cognitive load effects, but I'll talk about 3 or 4 of the more interesting, more important cognitive load effects. One of them is called the worked example effect. We can run experiments in which we can give people a series of problems to solve. Often happens in education, in all areas, both humanities and, say, mathematics. Giving somebody an essay to write means you're giving them a problem to solve. Complicated problem, but you're giving them a problem to solve. It's obvious that you're giving people problems to solve in mathematics and science. You can give people a series of problems to solve, and they'll learn a fairly slow way of learning. There's an alternative way. Instead of giving them problems to solve, you give them exactly the same problem, but you give them the solution to the problem, a worked example. Okay, a worked example that shows students how to solve that problem. And you give them lots of those worked examples, not just 1 or 2, lots of them. When you run those experiments, and we've run them, lots of them in mathematics, some of them in science, some of them in humanities, writing essays. Give people a model essay, tends not to be done, and it ought to be. And the results are very consistent. And this is a result that's been replicated again and again and again all around the world. The worked example group, when they're then given a test, and keep in mind, a test means that they're given a problem to solve, and they've been given less problems to solve than the group that's in the problem-solving group. So we have one group that's just given problems to solve, the other group are given a mixture of problems and worked examples. The worked example effect turns up again and again and again, and is probably the most reliable effect we've got. So that's probably the major cognitive load theory effect. Let's look at what appears to be a totally different effect, which we call the redundancy effect. Now, you may wonder why I'm delivering this talk without using PowerPoint or any other visuals. We've got data. Again, it's easily replicated. If you give people information presented in oral form, which is what I'm doing now, and give them either the same or different information visually, they'll do worse than if they're just given the same that information orally. If you think about it a bit, you can see why. Okay, you've got somebody like me standing up there busily talking. You're trying to listen to what I say, and then suddenly something appears up on the screen. Now, it may be more or less the same as what's being said, or it may be something entirely different. In either case, if you look at what's on the screen, you're not going to be listening to what's being said. If you listen to what's being said, you can't concentrate on what's on the screen. That's the redundancy effect. And redundancy has two meanings in English. It can mean the same information presented in a different way, or it can just mean additional information. Cognitive load theory uses both of those procedures. Redundancy applies to both of those. Some kids like studying while listening to music. You run an experiment with the music on and the music off. The kids who have the music off end up doing better on tests. Music is redundant. If you're looking at if you're reading from a textbook, or you're reading something from the internet and there's some really funny cartoons, that will get your attention, but you'll learn less. Let's go back to the worked example effect. So, giving people worked examples. Give them to people who are given the same problems which they have to solve themselves. You find a big difference. Keep on running the experiment. Have people continue to study worked examples, and the other group continue to solve problems. And a funny thing happens. The difference between the two groups decreases. Keep the experiment going. Suddenly you find no difference. Keep the experiment going some more. You get a difference again, but in the opposite direction. It's called the expertise reversal effect. So that's the third effect I'm talking about. It's due to redundancy. Studying a worked example, if you're a complete novice and the information is complex and difficult, is really, really beneficial. But as you gain more and more knowledge, you become more and more familiar with the information, that procedure of studying a worked example begins to be redundant. You don't need it anymore. It doesn't mean you don't need any more practice. What you now need to do is practice solving the problems. At some point, all you ought to be doing is practicing solving the problems. Because the ultimate aim is to have the information so well entrenched in long-term memory that you can easily, automatically bring it out when it's required and use it. So it doesn't just apply to the worked example effect. There's a lot of other effects which also are prone to expertise reversal. Cognitive load effects are primarily concerned with novel information and novel information that's complex. And keep in mind when I say it's complex depends what's in your long-term memory. That restaurant scenario I gave you is really complicated. We don't find it complicated because it's in miracle of what's in long-term memory having its effect on working memory. We can hold that entire scenario in working memory effortlessly, automatically. So those three, the reason I'm emphasising those three effects, they're important effects and they are related to each other. They have consequences for each other. I'm going to just talk about one more effect before concluding. It's a transient, it's called the transient information effect. Some information is transient. Other information is permanent. Let's go back to writing. The sole reason we invented writing, and it, as far as I can see, it is the sole reason, is we've transformed transient information, doing right now, speech, oral information, into permanent information. Now, the trouble with transient information is you can concentrate on what I'm saying now. If I ask you to tell me what I said 2 or 3 minutes ago, you may be able to do it. You probably won't. Speech is transient. Written information is permanent. And that's really important. It has effects on working memory. It's very, very hard to keep a lot of information presented in transient oral form in working memory. That has implications for the use of technology. We have a tendency to use technology in a way which in effect says, look, if we can produce something in this way, it's much better than using the old ways. Videos, animations provide an example. We can make things much, much more realistic by using animations, using videos. But look what we've done. We've turned something that's permanent, sets of diagrams or pictures or something like that, into something that's transient. And in the process of making it transient, we're overwhelming working memory. Just because you can do something using technology doesn't mean you should. This is a problem that arose well before modern technology, just fairly ancient technology of using movies. Show kids a movie about something, they may learn some things, but it's not easy. Movies which we use for entertainment, we can follow them because they're pretty simple. They have to be simple. Don't try to learn physics or the causes of World War I from a movie. So that's the transient information effect. Okay, look, I'll leave it there and see if there are any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. And so we will field some questions, and I might, we'll be juggling technology here. And so first of all, as we're looking at what's coming through on chat, I'll see if there are any questions in the audience here. And we can begin here, and then on chat we can move over to those questions. So in the room, one hand up, and John, I might get you to stand back in front of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Could you please share your perspective on the relationship, if there is a relationship, between cultural evolution, in the sense that human beings have the evolved capacity to learn culture in the species typical environment, and biological security? Is there any relationship?
Yeah. It's a very good question. They're closely analogous, and we've theorized they're closely analogous. If you look at cultural evolution and biological evolution, procedures are the same. You know, when we talk about, we're talking a lot about intelligent systems these days. Because of artificial intelligence, and we worry about what effects will artificial intelligence have on our societies and what cultural influences will it have. Well, there's another intelligent system out there, and that's evolution by natural selection. That system has managed to create, and it is a creative process, things which we not only can't create ourselves, can't even understand some of the things it's created. And it's created in exactly the same way. If you want to know the analogue of long-term memory in evolution, that's DNA, a massive long-term memory effect. And problem solving, random mutation is, you know, when we solve problems, it's really a random generate and test process. And that's exactly what evolution by natural selection does. And, you know, the people out there trying to work out ways of, for example, converting vegetable matter into meat artificially. Well, evolution has a self-replicating factory a few cubic centimetres in size, which has no trouble doing that at all. It's called a mouse. So I hope that goes some way towards answering your question.
Thank you, John. There's one question in the chat that's asking the article that I was quoting from, and so it's a 2016 article titled "Story of a Research Program," and it's published in Education Review. And the series is, John, I know this will make you uncomfortable, acquired wisdom series. So I do like embarrassing John in these ways.
Well done. You succeeded.
But there's a substantive question as well. And so for an anonymous attendee, are you concerned that your theory of cognitive load has been taken to an extreme in education in the form of direct instruction? There seems to be a conflation between direct instruction and explicit instruction. Maybe this last question is what we can talk to. Do you believe there is a place for a combination of pedagogies that balance explicit instruction and inquiry learning? And I'd actually scratched out a similar question around, is the expertise reversal effect something of a bridge here?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah, that's a good question. Look, for a novice learner in a complicated area, explicit instruction is everything. Having somebody who is really unfamiliar with the area, attempting to work things out for themselves, it really doesn't work. Really doesn't work. Once people have become more knowledgeable, once they have to start solving problems by themselves, they can engage in a degree of inquiry learning. They can engage in problem solving. You cannot do that. You cannot do that when you start learning. And there's a tendency sometimes to suggest, look, we can get people solving problems when they've got almost nothing in long-term memory. The ultimate aim is to get information into long-term memory. If you want somebody to engage in critical thought, if you want them to engage in creativity, first make sure there's lots and lots of information in long-term memory. The idea that we can critically think about something that we know almost nothing about, it really doesn't work. We can critically think, and we should critically think about areas that we are knowledgeable in.
Any questions from the room? There's another question here, and I'll repeat the question because I think the online folk don't hear it.
The best use of power. Following biological primary and biological secondary information, and whether you see this as a difference in category or a difference in degree, and whether what's biologically primary for one person will necessarily be biologically primary for another.
So I'll just repeat the question or summarise it. So just digging into whether a difference of degree and or a difference of kind in biologically primary knowledge and secondary knowledge, and whether for different people what is biologically primary for one person or what is biologically secondary for one person may be biologically primary for another. And also the questioner did commend and laud the exceptional PowerPoint presentation by John.
Yeah, that's an interesting question in several ways. It's not a continuum, but notwithstanding that, it is possible for things that are biologically primary for one person to be biologically secondary for somebody else. But that tends to occur when we have people who, there's an allowable and a non-allowable terminology here, people who have deficits of some sort. You can overcome those deficits. The deficits are due to biologically primary information missing or biologically primary skills missing. You can overcome them using the biologically secondary system. It's difficult and it takes a long time, but it's doable. I mentioned before that we have speech pathologists who know how to teach people how to speak. Now, most people don't need a speech pathologist, but some people have, for whatever reason, missed out on that biologically primary skill of being able to organise listening and speaking skills. They can overcome that using the biologically secondary system. In a way, I was an example of that. I think I was in my early teens before I realised that the sound we make for TH and the sound we make for F are different. I didn't distinguish between them. I just didn't pronounce that th in the normal way. I worked it out for myself, but it would have been handy to have a speech pathologist who could have told me in a few seconds. But that somewhere along the line, everybody else, or not everybody, most other people acquired that. I didn't.
Could Alan?
Thank you, John. Theory has taken consideration of developmental emergence of cognition in people or in others, but particularly in school-age young people. When maybe working memory has been shown to change over time in the growth of someone.
Yeah. Look, that's. Do you want to repeat the question?
No, the question was around looking at developmental shifts in working memory, but I think particularly interesting would be the shift across school life, because those developmental stages are very much core business for School of Ed.
Yeah. I talked about biologically primary and biologically secondary knowledge earlier on. When you're dealing with preschoolers or Year K kids, maybe Year 1 kids, they're still developing their biologically primary skills. We're talking about upper secondary school kids and university students. They're no longer developing their biologically primary skills. And you can see the difference in language. If somebody goes into a new language environment, a migrant goes into a new language environment before puberty, they will probably learn to speak that language at native level easily and automatically. If they go into that environment after puberty, that biologically primary system no longer seems to work. You've got to use the biologically secondary system to acquire the second language after about 12 to 14 years of age. I think that answers part of your question. There was another part, and that's changes in working memory. I'm not sure. I mean, look, I think most people out there seem to assume that working memory increases in size with the passage of time as people get older. I've got my doubts. Part of the problem is that we measure working memory by giving people something to do. They have to do something, and they have to memorize a series of words or a series of numbers or whatever. And yeah, the number we can remember keeps increasing. But that may be due to long-term memory. The biggest effect on working memory, if there is a developmental effect, the biggest effect is not developmental. It's what's in long-term memory. Working memory is completely transformed by what's in long-term memory. So that makes it difficult to have a very accurate measure of it. I mean, we know it's limited at whatever age when you're dealing with unfamiliar information. But the trouble is, what's unfamiliar for me may be extremely familiar for you. And so if you give somebody a working memory test, and it's easy to give somebody a working memory test, you're going to have an enormous working memory because of the effect of long-term memory. So it's small changes that some people talk about. I'm not sure they occur. They may. I'm not simply discounting them, but it's an interesting question. So.
I'm going to close with another question online, and that was a question, and I'm showing my bias here, John, the question around motivation. And so the question online is around, where does, for example, something like perseverance fit with biologically primary drive or primary, knowledge? I know you're sort of an outsider looking in on the world of motivation. You've always been clear on that, but just some thoughts as you've been an outsider looking in on that side of it.
The trouble with motivation is, it's incredibly important. It's if somebody's not motivated, nothing happens. Cognitive load theory is sort of worked on the assumption that we're only dealing with people who are motivated. And of course, in the real world, it's nothing like that. There's been an enormous amount of effort to converge motivation and cognition. They're both incredibly important. Whether one can converge them, I don't know. Look, I'll say one thing about motivation. One of my colleagues in the United States, David Feldon, did a whole lot of work on cognitive load theory and motivation. And what he found is the more you reduced cognitive load, external, unnecessary cognitive load, the higher was the motivation. In a way, that's not surprising. We like to succeed at things. And if you reduce cognitive load, you're more likely to succeed and you become more motivated. So in that sense, motivation goes in two ways. Cognition can increase motivation by that mechanism, but we also know there are other things that motivate people, and they need to be studied, and they don't necessarily have to merge. They can be independent factors that need to be considered. I've just about run out of what I know about motivation.
Well, we finally did it. We found the boundary conditions of Professor John Sweller's long-term memory with regard to motivation, at least. So we have found the limits long-term. Look, it's been a terrific 90 minutes. Well, not the first 10 minutes, I apologise for that, but subsequent to that, I like to think John picked the whole thing up and ran with it. Some major points, the cognitive architecture of the human mind, the categories of knowledge, the need to acquire and how to acquire biologically secondary knowledge, the need to process novel information, the transformative role of education. I think that I mean, there was so much cognitively stimulating, but that was probably the motivational and inspirational aspect of those 4 points, that transformative role. So I think I hope those online and those in attendance have got a lot out of this, the annual Sir Harold Wyndham Memorial Lecture. John, it's been, as always, a pleasure, as always, a walk away with a greater bank of long-term knowledge and a small token of our appreciation as to that. And please join me in thanking them. So folks online, thank you so much for being with us, and all the best for the rest of the evening, and same to those inside the hall.